Welcome to the Student Athlete Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Lemke, and today we're going to go a little bit behind the scenes of Major League Baseball scouting with Nate Metzger. He is a scout for the Chicago Cubs, so we'll be diving into what MLB scouts look for in athletes and what it takes to compete at that next level. But Nate's also a former college coach, and so we're going to be tapping into his experience on that level as well. So Nate, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, man, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I want to start off with a fun question. I know there's a million questions that we want to ask, MLB scouts that are not necessarily related to recruiting and scouting and whatnot, but I got to ask, like, what's draft week look like? Because I mean, we see glamorized movies like Draft Day and Moneyball and things like that, but what does it actually look like for you guys?
Well, I think what sticks out, and obviously this past year was my first draft, and I was an associate scout for the Braves back in Illinois for 20 plus years. And so really, even though this last year was my first year as a full-time scout with the Cubs, I had kind of been privy to, or, had gained some knowledge and access over the years prior with the Cubs. And so had a little bit of feel, but in regard to the draft itself, every organization is different in regard to whether or not they bring their scouts to their city for the draft itself. And a lot of clubs, obviously it's a cost cutting or cost saving measure where they're not going to fly everybody in and have everybody together for the draft, because a lot of what we compile, the information that we gather and compile and then turn into the club, it's already done. And so it was kind of a luxury or kind of a bonus for us. And I had guys, other area scouts say, hey, man, I've been doing this for, 10, 15 years, and I've never been in the draft room. But the Cubs were gracious enough to have us all there. So what a, phenomenal experience in my first year with my first draft to actually be in Chicago in the draft room and kind of get a look under the hood, if you will, or behind the scenes. And I think, my cross checker told me, he said, man, don't underestimate how valuable, that's going to be for you, in your first year to really get an inside look. Don't take it for granted. And so it was really, just being there was really cool. But I think everybody has this idea of the draft itself being, kind of like this, like Wall Street, like the stock market, papers flying everywhere, everybody's yelling and screaming. And it really wasn't that at all. It was much more organized. We all were seated at tables, and certainly our director, our scouting director, Dan Okantrovich, is phenomenal. And Dan had questions that he would go around and talk to guys and prior to making picks at times. But for the most part, it does move really fast. Once you've made a pick, you're gonna pick again in that that next round, and it moves fast. So the club pretty much has an idea of kind of who those targets are well in advance. But it was, again, really cool to see how the whole thing plays out behind the scenes being in the draft room.
Well, I'm glad it's not as chaotic as, say, Draft Day, portrays it. Granted, that's NFL, a little bit different, but at the same
Sure.
time, I'm sure there's some of those overlaps for sure.
Well, in Hollywood, right, they have to dramatize it some and play it up a little bit for the movie, but it was a really unique experience and definitely something that will be valuable moving forward for myself.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get into the recruiting aspect of it and the scouting aspect of it from the MLB focus. So when you're scouting, especially for the high school and college players, because that's a lot of who's going to be listening, what are some key things that you are looking for, and kind of focus on more so the things that like most scouts will look for? Because I know every team's going to be a little bit different, but some of those
You
core
know,
things.
and I think there is, and you mentioned, like, I spent most of my career, as a college coach, and recruiting is scouting, scouting is recruiting, but obviously, on the scouting side, it's just a higher profile player, that you're looking for and evaluating. There are so many more guys that are good Division I players or good college players that maybe never, have the opportunity, to be a draft guy. And so I think on one hand, at the college level, you're looking for maybe more intangibles. Hey, this guy really knows the game. This guy really works hard. There's maybe a place for that guy at the college level that unfortunately, at the professional level, maybe that guy gets weeded out a little bit, because tools do matter. I think in answer to your question, the number one thing is tools, and you say, why does, this guy that threw 10 innings for, this Division I school, this guy had an 8, this guy's ERA was 8. He walked more than he struck out. He walked more than, than innings pitched, but he got a shot. And that, I think, relates right back to, kind of the point that I made as far as tools matter. That guy was 98, that guy was 98, 99, and that guy may get a shot where, the pitchability guy, who probably has earned it, probably has been a lot more consistent. The performance says, man, this guy should get a shot. And that's where I think sometimes guys are, can get frustrated because the game doesn't necessarily reward the performer all the time as much as it rewards the guy with those loud tools. And so I think, but there is a place, for the intangibles guy as well. And I think that's what we try to do, our due diligence in scouting to, kind of uncover those guys and say, hey, this guy does have some ceiling left. This guy does have more in the tank, more tools that he can get to, let's don't ignore that guy either. Right. And so that I think, tools number one, and then, I think performance and some of those things kind of fall in line, after you evaluate the tools initially.
Yeah. What about size? Does size matter? Because there's like in our area, I mean, there's guys who are like 5'6", 5'7". There's other guys like I'm sure he's somebody that's going to be on maybe one of your guys' list is a Crew Schoolcraft, or yeah, I think that's how you say his last name. He's up in the Pacific Northwest here, and he's like 6'7", 6'8". So how does that play into?
I mean, you always, even at the college level, whether it's recruiting or scouting, you always want bigger, faster, stronger. And so that's a starting point. But again, when you start to look at Major League Baseball and, the Altuves and the David Ecksteins, I'm kind of dating myself with a David Eckstein reference, but you can look at, Major League rosters and kind of get a feel. It's like, how many guys, under 6 foot are really making significant contributions at the big league level on the mound? Probably not a lot, but there's still that guy. There's still that outlier. And I think if you're an outlier, you have to have a carrying tool, meaning, Rafael Belliard, again, to kind of date myself, Rafael Belliard was a guy with the Braves that really didn't hit much, but he was an unbelievable defender. So that his defense, the arm played, his defense played, and he hung around the big leagues for, 10, 15 years because of his defensive carrying tool. And so I think it's one of those where if you are that guy, who's 5'6", okay, what is that, what separates you? What is that carrying tool for you, that we can't ignore? And I think that's a little bit of what, I would say to that. Of course, you want the Aaron Judge, over the Jose Altuve, but at the same time, those guys that really hit, we kind of say, hey, it doesn't matter either. You might have to look a little bit harder. You might have to, go see a guy, more than once. But that's where performance does play into it, because all spring, we're going to follow these guys and keep an eye on guys in our territory who are really performing. And, we may even get an alert from the front office or from our scouting department that says, hey, have you seen this guy? And we don't have to like a guy, but if a guy's really performing, we may get an alert that says, hey, you need to at least see this guy and check that box. So there's a place for everybody. And I think baseball is probably unique, or a little bit more unique that way, where, the NFL, the NBA, you probably have to be, although again, as soon as I say it, I start thinking of Muggsy Bogues and Spud Webb, right? Guys that had careers in the NBA that were little dudes. So there's a place for everybody. It's just, again, I think a little bit harder for that guy to maybe get an opportunity. And so he's probably got to do a little bit more, just simply put.
Yeah, I mean, and I like that you make that point. They have to do a little bit more because I mean, you look at, like, I was reading a book talking about Babe Ruth versus Lou Gehrig, and how Babe Ruth, it was just like he was like just naturally gifted. Like, yeah, he worked, but he was very lazy in many senses of the word. And but
Yeah.
then you had Lou Gehrig, who wasn't naturally. He had to put in an insane amount of work and constantly did. And they both became legends. But you look at how much Babe Ruth could have been, if he wasn't
Right.
constantly eating hot dogs and drinking and throwing parties and stuff, versus Lou Gehrig and whatnot. So it's interesting that side by side, you just may have to work harder than the average.
And I do think it goes back to, like, at the end of the day, guys have to be a little bit weird. They have to be a little bit obsessed. They have to be a little bit different. And a term that we use, like in the industry, is wired different. Guys have to be wired a little bit different, because the reality is your God-given ability, kind of like you just referenced, that may get you in the door, right? Like, if a guy's super talented and super tooled up, it may get him drafted. But then, okay, now you've started that journey into pro ball, where, again, how different the baseball is. The NBA, you get drafted and you go right to the NBA, and they've got the developmental league and some of those things. But for the most part, you're getting drafted, you're getting a shot, to go right into the NBA or the NFL. And in baseball, it's like, hey man, your journey's just begun. And so my point with that being that you have to be wired a little bit different, to be able to actually get to and I think what you find with the big league guys is, not only are they the most tooled up, not only are they the most talented, but they're also the guys that work the hardest and are wired a little bit different. And that's what I think, even at the college level, I used to tell recruits, I'm like, listen, like, no matter how hard you think you're working right now, you're not working as hard as our guys. And I was at Wright State. I had the opportunity and was fortunate enough to be at Wright State for 8 years. I was at the junior college level prior. And that's something I always tell people when I got to Wright State. I thought our JUCO guys were tough, and I thought they worked hard. And not that they weren't, and not that we didn't. But when I got to Wright State, it was a totally different level of toughness and work ethic. And I think that's where you have to be borderline obsessed with, like, being that guy, and with the reality that injuries are going to occur. Opportunities may not fall in your favor, and you may not get drafted. You may not get that shot. But if you do, and maybe that's what it takes just for you to get that opportunity. But then if and when you get that opportunity, man, it's almost like the high school kid who, signs or commits to premium Division I program. Oh, okay, I've made it. It's like, no,
Yeah.
that's when the work actually starts. And kind of the same thing with pro ball. It's like, okay, you just got drafted. Congratulations. And that's an awesome, first step. But if the goal is to reach the big leagues, then man, your work has just begun. And it's just, I think, just knowing how much work it takes, and being, again, a little bit, being willing to be different. Are eating differently than your buddies at the high school lunch table? Are you willing to pack your lunch every day and have a protein smoothie that everybody's like making fun of you and thinking you're a weird guy? It's like, no, that's just what it takes. And I think now, with all we're in such a, not to get too long winded, I'll throw it back to you here in a second. But like with the information age, there's just so many resources out there that you can get great information to where if you're not doing those things, like everybody else is going to pass you. Like think about the weight room. The weight room used to be like if you're in there 5, 6 days a week, man, you're so far ahead of everybody. Well, now if you're not in there 5 or 6 days a week, you're so far behind everybody that you're never going to catch up. And so I think that's where guys, the willingness to really push and make those efforts. And I think from a scouting standpoint, that's where for us, you know, biggest part of my job is not so much to evaluate the tools or the player. It's to evaluate and find out what makes that guy tick. And does he have some of that extra, like we've been talking about, to potentially get him to the big leagues, because that's, we're not supposed to draft a guy unless we feel like, or we're not supposed to, take it back a step further. We're not supposed to turn a guy in, write a guy up and turn a guy in as a potential draft unless we feel like he can be a big leaguer. And so we better know some of those intangible things, what makes this guy, tick, as I said earlier, and is he wired right, to kind of use that term again.
Yeah. I like that. There's so much good stuff in that. And just a fair warning to you guys, if you haven't actually looked at the time frame, we're definitely going to go over 30 minutes because there's just too much good stuff to hit on. And I'm like, we have questions. I'm like, I definitely want to address too. And so it's going to go longer. It's going to happen.
That's a nice way of saying that I'm too long-winded as well.
No, like legit though, like there were so many things that I want to turn into like a reel, into a, clip to like post about, just from what you just said, that the last few minutes, because there is a lot of important things that athletes need to hear. Like you look at, like you're talking about that being wired different, and the work has just begun. I mean, look at Aaron Judge. He was 25 when he finally made it to actually like the majors. So
yeah.
like, sometimes you have to work really hard. And also, when you talk about wired different, I was on a call with somebody who needs to address their nutrition, and he committed to his dream D1 university. Right at junior year, he got the offer, and he wasn't expecting it, stoked. But then he's like, I got work to do because I'm 6'3", 6'4", and I'm like 160 pounds. So he's like, I gotta put in more work. And so he's like deciding what he needs to sacrifice in order to get to his goal of getting also bigger, stronger. So he has that velocity and everything too. So I like that.
No doubt.
So let's talk about how student athletes can get noticed by scouts. So first off, where do you find the athletes, the young athletes especially? I know you mentioned, there's some other people in the back end that are kind of helping with that, but we've got travel teams, we got showcases, we've got like film online. Like where is it that you guys typically actually see these guys?
I think that's always the task for us. And I kind of referenced how much information. Think about we talked about Hollywood or movies, and there have been a lot of movies on scouting, scouts, and kind of that whole process. And there was one movie, I'm not going to be able to remember the title of it, but it's like this country boy out in the middle of a cornfield, and the big red barn, that the family farm, and the kid is out there, and the scout is driving down a long, dusty, windy road in the middle of nowhere, to track this kid down. And I think what I mentioned earlier is social media, with the internet, with the information age that we live in, like there really aren't guys hiding under a rock anymore, right? The day of that, finding that high school kid, out behind the big red barn on the dusty country road, like I just don't know that guy exists, because there's just so many, with Perfect Game, with PBR, with Twitter, all these different, services and, companies that are recruiting based and scouting based. I think our job is to track down those guys. And it starts like when the draft finishes, it's like, okay, the 24s are done. Now we're on to the 25s, or those guys that are 25, they're eligible for the 2025 draft. And so it's like, okay, how do we start that process? And that's what you're asking. A lot of those guys, we will have seen. So if I have my territory includes 5 states. And so if I've got my territory kind of on lockdown and I know what I need to know, a lot of the colleges I've seen prior, I've seen the past year. And so those guys who are now draft eligible, I have a pretty good idea. Although the wrench that's been thrown into it now is the transfer portal, right? And so University of Kentucky being one of my schools, one of the premier schools in my territory, well, UK's got 15 guys that I've never seen before, and I'm going to have to go track those guys down in the fall. The high school guys, we're trying to get out and we're trying to see, Perfect Game National, East Coast Pro, area codes out in California. Like, we're going to try to attend and see the premier events, but there's always the guy, and I live in Ohio. Ohio's another one of my states that I cover. And in Ohio, there's always a guy that, maybe he didn't get invited to the East Coast Pro or the area code stuff. And so I've got to know about those guys. And so really it's constant communication with the high school coaches. Maybe we get to know and kind of get our foot in the door with the PBR guys or the Perfect Game guys. And so, we're having some conversations behind the scenes. I mean, it's, you think about how much we drive, and you can only listen to so many podcasts, no offense, right? But a lot of that drive time is on the phone. A lot of that drive time is just checking in with people and, hey, this guy's popped up. Do I need to see him? Can I trust the information that I'm getting on him? Or, do I kind of wait on him? Right. And that's where I think we all have decisions to make in terms of, what guys do we chase down immediately? What guys do we wait on a little bit? And a lot of the information that's out there is actually pretty good information, pretty real information. You don't have to worry, too much, hey, I heard this guy was up to 95 and you go see him and it's 85. Those days have kind of come and gone a little bit. Like, now everything can be verified with TrackMan and some of the, the tools that we have access to. The Cubs have an unbelievable system. Our computer system that we use is so rich with data and information that it's almost insane, like how much how much information we have access to. And so, we can kind of cross check guys and start to, as I mentioned, that as the draft finishes and we start to put our list together, follows and guys that we need to see for the coming draft, you just start to kind of put those pieces in place, and put those pieces together, as it plays out and as that information rolls in. And I think a lot of times too, you're getting good information. Like, I don't necessarily have to reach out because I know a lot of the guys that are in the know are going to reach out to me, as well with some of that information. So there's no real one answer to that question. It really is. It involves a lot, but I think it's part of the fun in terms of making sure that no stone is left unturned and nobody is missed in terms of, I don't have to like them all. Right. I don't have to turn them all in as potential drafts, but I want to make sure. And I think talk about being wired different. Like, as a scout, I have to be wired a little bit differently too, in terms of, kind of being obsessed with making sure I have it covered. Right. And making sure that I know, my territory really well.
Yeah. No, that's good. Any advice that you would share with athletes to get themselves more visible, attractive, or would it be more so just continuing to do the things, make sure that you're actually posting your stuff and like getting out there?
I think the one thing that I would add to kind of what I just said is the people in their corner, meaning, if they're doing lessons or they have a facility, or somebody that they train with, the high school coaches, the college coaches, like, for the most part, the high school coaches and college coaches are pretty good about providing us with that information and kind of getting it out there. I would say, guys have to be a little bit cautious or a little bit careful. And I'm primarily speaking to the high school athlete. And by being careful, I'm saying trying not to be, super self-promotional on Twitter or Instagram or what have you. That can be, misconstrued, or maybe it's construed the right, maybe that's exactly, a kid being a little bit over the top or a little bit extra with some of their self-promotion. Like, guys don't necessarily need to, post every bullpen they throw and, highlight everything that they're doing, just because it can kind of come off the wrong way and have a bad look. I think for the most part, a little bit of what I'm trying to say is, if you're good enough, like, we're going to know, like, who you are. And, probably get eyes on you, if we know that you're a name, just a name that pops up. I just got a name yesterday from a Division III coach, and this kid is, probably pretty super under the radar, really a school in my territory that I've never been to. I've never, really hadn't heard of him very much. And he's a guy that I'm going to have to track down. As soon as their coach gave me the information on him, I talked to another coach in their conference, and he's like, yeah, it's a pretty real arm. You probably, should try to see him this fall, if possible. So, it's a network, man. It's a network thing. And I think for us, it's a network, but also, for the high school kids, it's, having that network and, knowing that the people in your corner are going to get, word out on you.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's, again, a lot of important things that a lot of the athletes I see, whether they're ones I'm working with or ones that I'm like following, I like a lot of those points, like the not overdoing it. And when it comes to posting, some people are posting every single day on Twitter, and I'm like, holy cow, you need to chill. It's
Right.
like, if you had like information overload, and it's like,
And,
coaches don't have time for that, scouts don't have time for that. So like, yeah,
and
I
I
like
think
those.
it's kind of a fine line too, because you want to encourage guys to be proactive. Like, being proactive is a good thing, but there's a fine line there too. And all of a sudden, a guy that is simply being proactive is labeled as being overly self-promotional or what have you. So it is, and I think it's kind of the simple rule. Like, if you don't think, or if you think maybe you're overdoing it, you probably are, right? Like, if you have to ask yourself that question, then you probably already know the answer a little bit.
So I get into a little bit of, just because you have that college experience and now the scouting experience, what, when we talk about transitions, because just like you were talking about earlier, we want to make sure that we're not just stopping, like that college offer or that commitment or that pro draft, whatever. We can't just stop there. So what do you are things that athletes need to have a successful transition from high school to college, and then from like college to the pros?
This is another really good point that I think, I heard this, not this past draft, but the 2023 draft. And I believe it was Jay Johnson from LSU that had made the comment, like, on MLB Network, like, as the draft is going down, and he's in the studio and they're talking to him, and his comment was, and I'll never forget it, and I'll always use this, with high school guys especially. His comment was, the transition from high school to college is tougher than the transition from college to pro ball. And I think I think he's right. I think there are so many truths, like, hidden in that statement. And I think it's one where, kind of going back to what I said previously about how hard guys have to work. I think if you've gotten drafted and you're going into pro ball, you've probably learned how to work. You probably have a really good idea of what it takes. And I'll use Wright State again, because I think it is, Wright State doesn't have football, right? It's 20,000 is the enrollment. So it's not small, but it's definitely not a big campus. And there really isn't. And that's kind of the joke amongst, the players there. There's really not a lot to do. And so the joke at Wright State was, if guys aren't in class, they're on the field. They're at the field. They're doing something baseball related with all their free time. And it really was that type of effort that kind of stuck out to me, where it's like, man, like these guys are borderline nuts. Like these guys are borderline crazy for the amount of work and time that they put into it. And, we were pretty fortunate. I think it was 24 guys drafted in my 8 years at Wright State, which is a pretty high number. But if you break that down, it's like, well, that's only, 3 guys a year, right? It's not like we had 5 or 6 guys every year or 10 guys. And so a lot of these guys who are working that hard, the reality is they're not going to get that opportunity, but they were still willing to work that hard. And I think that's where, kind of going back to Jay Johnson's comment about the transition from high school to college, that's where guys need to be, really prepared in terms of what it's going to look like, how much time and effort has to be spent, not only on the field, but with the diet nutrition aspect, with the strength and conditioning aspect. How much time. Peyton Burdick was a 3rd rounder. He's been up and down a little bit in the big leagues, was drafted by the Marlins. He's with the Reds now. And Burdick was a guy that, we'd have a Sunday doubleheader, and that dude would be in the weight room. We were fortunate. We had a weight room at the field. He would be in the weight room at 6 a.m. on a Sunday before we were getting ready to play a doubleheader. And it was like, and I'm not saying he was banging out, heavy reps, but like he was going to get his lift in, he was going to get his work in, and it just became part of him. Like that's just that's all he knew. And I think that's where, the high school athlete just has to understand like how much effort it's going to take, just to probably get on the field at a Division I, let alone the draft down the road, right? Like just being, I've said it so many times, I hate to repeat it, but like being obsessed, man, like being all in, however you want to, term it or state it, like that transition to the college level is really hard. For any freshman at any level to play significantly as a freshman, it's tough, really tough, like really, really hard, but that should be the goal. That should be the goal, as a freshman, come in and get your feet wet right away, jump in there, but it's going to be hard, so balancing that mindset of I'm going to do it, but also knowing like, man, it's going to be really tough.
I like that. That's good. That's good. Well, to wrap up, what would be the most important piece of advice you would give to a student athlete who dreams of playing in the?
I think it starts now. Like that's where, some of what we've touched on, as far as the willingness to be different and do those extra things, like that's what it's going to take. Like, again, like you always have the guy that, a high school teammate that you say, man, he hasn't had to work for it. Like it's just fallen in his lap. He's gifted, God-given, whatever, again, term you want to use. But at the end of the day, that guy, I think to be a big leaguer, ultimately it's both. Those guys are the most talented, but they're also the hardest workers. They're also the guys who have all the other details really, really well worked out and orchestrated within who they are. JJ Weatherholt was first round. He was the 7th overall pick of the Cardinals, and JJ was in my territory. What an absolute pleasure, like to talk to that guy, because and he was a guy like in the dugout, on the field, like he had fun, like he enjoyed the game. He would let his hair down, and he was top step of the dugout guy. He was injured a lot this past year, and probably cost him. There was talk that he could have been the 1st overall pick, had he been healthy at West Virginia. But what a pleasure to talk to that guy. And you talk about a guy that had all his ducks in a row and just buttoned up and really, just a mature kid, and like I said, to talk to him, you'd say, well, he's probably, Mr. Serious on the field. And he wasn't always. Like he still had fun. He still enjoyed the game, but like he just had everything lined up. And I think that's what it's got to look like. Not only are you really, really talented, but man, you have, all those other things in place as well, for you to get there. It is hard. It's really hard. And I think, the draft now being 20 rounds, I mean, not that long ago, the draft was 50 rounds. And so you've more than cut the draft in half, and there are less minor league teams. And so, for guys to get that opportunity, it's hard. It's really tough. But I think that's where it's probably how much more fulfilling it is when a guy does get that opportunity. I drafted a guy with the Cubs this year, Owen Ayers was a catcher out of Marshall. And when I drafted him, man, just the sheer like enjoyment that I got from seeing his enjoyment, I mean, it's hard to beat. Like it really is. And I miss the player interaction. Like being on the scouting side, you don't have the opportunity to be in the clubhouse with the guys every day, and I miss that greatly. But you kind of replace it with those experiences like an Owen Ayers, who is so appreciative. He's so thankful. He's so grateful, that the Cubs gave him the opportunity. And I know he's going to work his tail off to do everything he can, whether he becomes a big leaguer or not. That guy's always going to be thankful for the opportunity. And, that's another one. Like, I think the two most underused words in the English language are please and thank you. Like truly, like just being grateful for the opportunities you get, whether it's parents or your coaches. Like you don't have to love your high school coach, but man, that guy's pouring a lot of time and effort into you. Be thankful. Even if he's a guy that is hard to like, be thankful for that guy, because somebody's got to put up with you. Somebody's got to give you that time. And the great player is awesome. Being a great dude, being a great person is that much more valuable.
And when you talk about being wired different, that's very much like you said, it's being wired different, not just physically, like not just how you train, but also how you interact with people. So no, I lots of good. So Nate, I know the audience, I mean, if you guys go find Nate, don't be like, oh, hey, recruit me, like or scout me, that's not how it's going to work. But if they have like questions about the process, is there an easy way to reach out to you on that?
Yeah, you guys can feel free, whether it's, email is probably the easiest. It's N as in Nate, and then Metzger, my last name, ETZGER, Metzger @Cubs.com. Pretty simple. And that's kind of how I've replaced the player. I touched on or mentioned missing the players. And so having some of that interaction with guys, I don't mind at all. And it kind of replaces that element for me. So I would be happy to hear from some guys and be able to, answer some more questions a little bit in more detail if they want, for sure, man. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you hopping on today. Like, I think the greatest takeaway anybody can take from this is, to sum it all up is, be wired different, be weird. I feel like that sums up everything that you say is we just have to be different. Like realistically, like any success, you look at any successful person and that's what they do. And so if you love baseball as much as you say you do, like you got to, so I appreciate you again hopping on.
Yeah, no, man, it's been great. And I appreciate you. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. But guys, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast for more interesting insights and keep striving for